Hello, welcome to our virtual symposium, Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. My name is Christian Martir, Public Programs Manager for the Museo del Barrio. Before we begin, we wanted to cover some housekeeping points. Today's event will run from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. We'll begin with an introduction by a curatorial team, Rodrigo Mora and Susanna Temkin, followed by a break. At 2:30, our first panel, Institutions and Representation, will begin, followed by a break. At 3:45, our second panel, Black Modernists in the Americas, will begin, followed by a brief break. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the keynote speaker today is unable to attend. We are grateful to have Decolot providing interpretation services, who will be going over how to access their services.
Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es José Eduardo y junto con Ale estaré interpretando entre inglés y español para la sesión del día de hoy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is José Eduardo, and along with Ale, I'll be interpreting between English and Spanish for today's session. En su pantalla de Zoom deberían ver un icono de globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. El icono va a decir interpretación. Pueden hacer clic en este icono y seleccionar el idioma en el que les gustaría escuchar y participar el día de hoy. So you should be seeing a small globe icon in the lower part of your Zoom screen that says interpretation. You'll click on this icon and select the language in which you would like to listen and participate during today's session. Por ejemplo, si le gustaría escuchar y participar en español, puede escoger español. For example, if you would like to listen and participate in Spanish, you would select Spanish. También si nos acompaña si se está conectando de un tablet o teléfono móvil, puede hacer clic en los tres puntitos que se encuentran en la esquina de abajo de su pantalla. De nuevo, seleccionar donde dice interpretación de idiomas y seleccionar el idioma que le gustaría utilizar el día de hoy. Also, if you are joining us through a tablet or a smartphone, you can click on the three little dots that are on the bottom corner of your screen and again, select language interpretation and choose the language you would like to use and participate today. Para las personas bilingües, les pedimos que escojan un canal. Si van a cambiar de un idioma al otro, recuerden, por favor, también cambiar el canal que han seleccionado. For bilingual folks, we do ask you to choose a language channel. If you would like to change between languages, just make sure that you are also changing the corresponding language channel on your screen. Ahora vamos a empezar la interpretación simultánea y voy a dar el resto de las instrucciones en español. Now we're going to start the simultaneous interpretation and I will give the rest of the instructions in Spanish. Les pedimos, por favor, a todos los ponentes que nos ayuden hablando en voz alta y a velocidad moderada. También les pedimos que solamente una persona hable a la vez para no tener que privilegiar una voz sobre la otra. Si necesitamos que hablen más alto o un poco más despacio, les dejaremos saber a través del chat. También a los participantes les pedimos que no sufran en silencio si la interpretación no está funcionando o están teniendo algún problema. Déjenos saber a través del chat y les podemos ayudar. Gracias al Museo del Barrio y a todos los organizadores por su compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. Muchas gracias y que disfruten la sesión de hoy.
Good afternoon, boa tarde, buenas tardes. I'm Rodrigo Moura. Rodrigo Moura é o Museu del Barrio's Chief Curator. And I'd like to thank everyone for the participation in today's virtual symposium around our exhibition, Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. Special thanks to Susanna Temkin, co-curator of the exhibition and co-organizer of today's program, and to Elena Vidal, Christian Martyr, and Mark Manolfi for their work in public programs and tech, making the symposium today possible to us all to enjoy. Also, big thanks to our speakers today who accepted to share their knowledge and time. and to our interpretation team, Tecoloto. It is a big pleasure to welcome you all today at El Museo's virtual space. In this introduction, me and Susanna would like to share a bit with you about the genesis of this project and different aspects of it. Popular Painters is a long-term project for El Museo del Barrio. It started in 2019 as a research idea around the collection of El Museo. It was triggered by initial research I was doing back then in the research, having recently arrived in my post as chief curator at El Museo, and some specific finds or works or groups of works that I encountered during these initial studies on the collection. Especially two major gifts that the museum received in the early 2000s were an important starting point for this project, and I would like to name them. One was the gift of the collection, part of the collection of art historian and a collector, Barbara Duncan, to El Museo, with a number of paintings by different artists working in different parts of the Americas, somehow under this label that we decided to go with, or to go for Popular Painters, including the wonderful painting by Todos Prazeres that we're now seeing on our screen. The other one is the major gift of the Seagulls, a family from New York, of Haitian paintings, especially of the Port-au-Prince School of Painting from Haiti. So with those works in mind, I started to work on a very small exhibition of collection items only initially, to be presented in 2020. However, the pandemic affected everybody's exhibition schedule, and we decided to then create in the department a virtual exhibition, an online exhibition, which then became Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. That online exhibition premiered in 2020, in the summer of 2020, and that provided somehow a first iteration for the project and the first list of works. For that iteration, we decided already to go beyond the collection items, to go beyond the collection objects, and explore what we then call the virtual loans, right? So the virtual loans was a category we came up with for that project, where we approached different collections, foundations collections, and especially museum collections. And we asked them permission to use an image of a work of the collection as part of our online exhibition, right? So in this case now, we're seeing some images of the installation view here, works by the Museum of Modern Art, for instance, of Museo de Arte de São Paulo, that initially were entered in our website or online exhibition. Moving forward, we decided that that project that premiered in 2020 would be made into an exhibition in the real space of the museum. And that's when I invited Susanna Temkin to be the co-curator of the project with me, who brought different perspectives into the research, especially more pronounced interest for female artists and artists based in the United States, working in the United States. So this is another aspect that, or another facet of this project when it was transformed into an exhibition online. Then in its turn, opened in November of 2021, examining the practice of 35 self-taught and formally trained artists working on the margins of modernism and the mainstream art world throughout the Americas. The exhibition has its main mission to promote new dialogues between US Latino and Latin American artists around the mid-20th century, working around the mid-20th century, with an emphasis on the African diaspora in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Again, in response to some of those initial works that we identified in the collection as a starting point for this research. Thus, the term popular painters is used here to identify artists who, because of their class or racial backgrounds, have been excluded from the so-called official art history and classified by terms such as naive and primitive, labels that we reject as pejorative, prejudiced, and reductive. Some of the themes that we work for this exhibition include labor, religion, festivities, architecture, as well as popular visual sources referencing the body, consumption, indigeneity, and syncretism, providing the narrative thread of the exhibition. So I would like to invite Susanna to share a few thoughts about how the exhibition is presented in the galleries. And again, I thank you all for being here with us today.
Thank you, Rodrigo, and thank you for inviting me to join you in co-curating this show and realizing the exhibition. The translation from the online version to the in-person version was really interesting museologically to participate in. I think it's often the other way around. So it was a real pleasure to be thinking with you and today with our colleagues about this particular show, Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. What you all have been seeing on the screen is a walkthrough of the exhibition. We seem to be a little bit stuck on this slide, but it's actually a great example to show the real coast to coast, ocean to ocean, from the very bottom of South America, with the work all the way on the left by Luis Herrera from Chile in Valparaiso, to artists working in New York. This image of this skyscraper-like balconied building by Felix Cordero. And here we have works by Mario Sanchez. As Rodrigo mentioned, when I joined this team, part of my contributions was to really be able to help increase the visibility of artists who are working in the United States, to put them in dialogue with some of the artists from across the Caribbean, like Prophet Dufaux, who you're seeing here, or artists from throughout Latin America, and in the case of Vasilia Guillen from Nicaragua. And we think that's a particularly rich contribution that we hope to be able to share, and something that we believe may be unique to this particular show. I briefly, in the time remaining, and as we continue to walk through the galleries, would like to remind everybody the show is up through the end of this weekend. So if you're in New York, please, we hope you can visit. And for those who aren't able to join us in person, just to nuance the curatorial vision behind it, as Rodrigo mentioned, this emphasis on the popular was not only, extending and nuancing some of the art historical terms that have been applied to these artists in the past, but also related to the themes, the iconography, and in many cases, the material and the artistic practices involved by the artists that we're featuring. So a great example, for example, is with Felipe Jesus Gonçalves, a Cuban-born artist who emigrated to the United States and was really using popular imagery found in magazines, newspapers. In the case of those two works, iconography found on the dollar bill that he was cutting up to really create these very acerbic collages. And we wanted to address this term of the popular, which really runs throughout the exhibition, going through four main themes. The first theme is visible, invisible, and we include a number of artists from the African diaspora practicing in Haiti, Brazil, and also artists working in the United States to really emphasize iconography related to Afro-diasporic religions, related to spirituality. And in many cases in this particular section, not only do we see imagery from popular rituals and ceremonies, but some of the works, as in the case of Antoine Oleant, whose voodoo banners we'll see in just a few minutes, really blur the edge between objects used in practice and artworks. The second section in the exhibition is Inside Outside. It's a section where we're hoping to nuance certain art historical genres like the interior, the still life. And in this section, which we will get to in just a moment on the slideshow, we also present three Black modernist artists, Aitor dos Prazeres from Brazil, Misia Stefani, and Horace Pippin, who are actually the inspiration for panel 2 that will begin in just about an hour. The third section of the exhibition is public-private, and it's the most extensive section of the exhibition, and it focuses primarily on landscapes, but also the man-made interventions that are taken into it. In that section, we see a number of streetscape scenes, and it also is a moment of reflecting. Not only we see images of artists reflecting on nationalist mythologies, but also on utopian visions, thinking again about this mid-century modern moment, a time when throughout the Americas and really throughout the world, we could say, the building of cities was really booming, and thinking about one's relationship to it, be that whether you were looking from the margins onto the urban city or working within the urban environment yourself. And then finally, the exhibition concludes with a section entitled Animal Human, where we really hope to question some of the anthropocentric concepts that are so often embedded in Westernized thinking. And in this section, we see, again, artists who are, of course, working with the bodily figures, be that the figures of domestic or wild animals, or of course, humans in motion, and also the frenetic energy that's built into this. So that is a brief overview of Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. And again, we welcome you all to come to the museum and hopefully experience the show for yourself. And Rodrigo, I welcome you back if we have any departing words. Otherwise, we will pause for a brief interlude before our first panel begins at the 2:30 mark.
Thank you, Susanna. I think we should all take a quick break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes for the first panel.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us again. For those of you who just logged on, I'm Susana Temkin. I'm a curator at El Museo and one of the co-curators of Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. So we're just about to open panel 1, Institutions and Representation. This will be a panel that is considering the concept of the institution as well as the institutional forces behind the representation of artists who are working beyond conventional circuits. This panel will explore the who, the how, and the why certain artists achieve visibility, as well as the lack thereof. To start, I am going to share my screen, if I can please have access to that. I wanted to begin by just briefly sharing some thoughts about El Museo's own relationship as an institution and as a framework for how this concept of the popular or so-called popular painters have been exhibited in the past before I introduce our esteemed speakers. So for those of you who join us, as we were briefly explaining in our curatorial introduction, as you know, approximately half of the works in the show come from El Museo's collection, many of them thanks to the generosity of donors such as Barbara Duncan, the estate of Barbara Duncan. 3 works by Prevette Dufaux, who have come to El Museo as part of a larger gift to the institution. As well as a large gift of works from the Haitian School of Art that were generously donated to the Siegel family. Both of these donations are more recent donations from the mid-2000s, but something that both the curatorial team finds very fascinating is how this notion of popular, or how some of the artists that we're featuring in the current exhibition have been a part of the collection for many years. And indeed, I think an interest in the popular was really baked into some of the inception of the collection at El Museo. So among them is the artist Pedro Villarin, a Nuyorican artist practicing right here in East Harlem, who in 1981 was given an exhibition, a solo exhibition at El Museo del Barrio. And in the introduction to the show, very interestingly, Luis Cancel describes him as, quote, a poet and a visionary. So alongside Villarin, we also have a number of works by the Nuyorican artist, also Eloy Blanco, who really became collected under the leadership of Jack Agüeros, who was El Museo's director from 1977 to 1986. And this engagement with Eloy Blanco's work has really continued today from those early moments. Again, another early solo exhibition of Eloy, but it's continuing today through a recent donation of archives, composition books, and other ephemera related to Eloy's practice that was recently gifted to El Museo, and parts of which are shown in Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. And again, Eloy Blanco was really collected under the care first of Jack Agüeros, and I myself am particularly interested in Jack's interest in Gregorio Marsan, the artist who we are featuring in Popular Painters and Other Visionaries through this bestiary of sorts. Gregorio Marsan, another East Harlem-based artist who is very well known for creating this assemblage like sculptures of animals, but also New York-related buildings such as the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty. And El Museo, we have the largest collection of works by Gregorio Marsan, who is also included in other collections like the American Folk Art Museum, the Smithsonian, the Fenimore. But I really am very fascinated by Jack's particular inclusion and recognition of Gregorio Marsan's artistic ability. Here, this bust of a man which we see and which is currently on view. We can see in this archival photograph featuring Jack Agüeros and Gregorio Marsan, currently held in the papers of Jack Agüeros at Columbia University. And it's really a testament, I think, to the relationship between the two. Supposedly, Gregorio Marsan originally came to El Museo with his artworks that he wanted to sell in El Museo's tienda, in the store, and it's through Jack Agüeros' vision that the works instead entered the collection. And yet, I've been really fascinated again with how Jack himself viewed Gregorio Marsan. And there's a number of quite interesting quotes in his papers where he seems to be grappling with how to position Gregorio Marsan. So this is just a brief note found in Jack's papers where he writes things like, "I believe he is a genuine primitive craftsman, yet he is not motivated by art for art's sake, or is he?" And then on the right, this is again from Jack's papers, photographs by Jack Agüeros, in which we see Gregorio Marsan's name under the banner of artesano. So again, this concept of craftsman, artist is really at play, and I think is hopefully a good way for us to start today's first panel. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Raphael Konig. Raphael, if you want to join us, turn on your camera. Raphael is a visiting lecturer at the University of Toulouse, head of visual arts at the Atelier for Artists in Exile in Paris, and the former director of the Ceres Franco Museum in France. He's held the Leonard Lauder Foundation Fellowship in He has held the Leonard Lauder Fellowship in Modern Art at the Metropolitan Museum and received his PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University. So Raphael, without further ado, we look forward to hearing from you right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a generous introduction. And I'm really happy and excited to participate in this panel, and because I think the exhibition is like a really important and timely contribution to the field. So I actually want to start with a quote from a recent interview given by Rodrigo Moura in Art Press, so published in Art Press in January 2022. Because my presentation today will be kind of an illustration of that. In different parts of the Americas, so I'm starting to quote, elite artistic institutions opened sustained dialogues with working class or popular artists who did not necessarily have access to formal artistic education. These contexts are integral to the process of artistic modernity in South and Central America, and also in the United States. An important element of the exhibition is thus to offer a survey of key art critics, curators, or institutional figures who were also part of this process. Popular painters did not in fact work in isolation, but developed and maintained strong institutional connections. Paintings by Heitor dos Prazeres were exhibited in the second biennial of Sao Paulo in 1953, while the work of Brazilian painter Chico Da Silva was championed by Swiss art critic and painter Jean-Pierre Chablot, and that of Nicaraguan painter Asilia Guillen by Cuban art critic Jose Gomez Sicre. End quote. And the specific example of that I think would support this position that I want to very briefly talk about today is, if you can see all see my screen, is from the example of Ceres Franco. Ceres Franco might not be a household name right just yet, but she has had a very kind of fascinating trajectory, specifically as one of these key characters for transmissions of between these so-called avant-garde and so-called self-taught kind of realms. And she was kind of moving seamlessly between these kind of polarities, but also within her native Brazil and Western Europe, where she was based for most of her life. So that's, and I want to mention that Ceres Franco, who was born in 1926, passed away very recently, in fact, on November 16th, 2021. And I want to dedicate this presentation to her memory. And it has been a real honor to work directly with her on the first monograph dedicated to her work, which was published in 2019. So very briefly, to give an outline of Ceres Franco's trajectory, she was born in Bages in 1926. She worked in Rio. She then studied art history in New York, including under Meyer Shapiro, and then moved to Paris in the early 50s. She started off as an arts correspondent for major Brazilian newspapers, including O Globo or Cruzeiro, for instance, and started being kind of an independent curator avant la lettre, because it wasn't really an established profession by then, as early as 1962. So her kind of pioneering role in the realm of kind of independent curatorship should also, I think, be recognized. And she, like these activities, she did under the general banner of the ox's eye, which is the general kind of catchphrase for her work. You see one illustration of this by Roman Kislevitz, who was one of the kind of major graphic designers that she worked with very early on. So Ox's Eye was the kind of general label for both her personal kind of curatorship independently from 1962 onwards, and then for actual kind of art gallery that she opened kind of properly in Paris in 1972. For specialists of Latin American art history, and specifically of Brazilian art history, her kind of most famous like feat of arms, so to speak, is the exhibition Opinion 65, which has marked kind of the history of Brazilian art and is usually described as a turning point, as this kind of shift from abstraction towards kind of politically committed figuration, as an answer to the kind of coup d'etat in Brazil. And it's also extremely famous for launching the career of Eloy Blanco. So we see, for instance, here on the cover of the exhibition catalog, Parangole, designed by Eloy Blanco. Obviously, I think I don't need to repeat the details of like the kind of dramatic kind of ban from Oiticica's performance from the museum, which during the opening night, which created a huge kind of scandal, but also kind of contributed to launching Oiticica's career. And Ceres Franco and her co-curator, Jean Bogici, were kind of both extremely supportive of Oiticica throughout the process. And so besides these exhibitions, Opinion 65, and the slightly lesser known Opinion 66, which happened the following year in Rio, that you see here on the screen, Ceres Franco should also be remembered for working with major kind of avant-garde figures, such as Corneille Beverlot, who is a member of Cobra, but also, as I mentioned, Roman Kislevitz. So Kislevitz was an exiled graphic artist from Poland, also worked as a graphic designer. Ceres Franco worked with him very early on, and then he went on to design exhibition catalogs for the Centre Pompidou, including the major catalogs, Paris-Berlin, Paris-Moscow, etc. But specifically, I think a major contribution of Ceres Franco that should be kind of underlined more is her kind of pioneering thinking of, you know, questioning the boundaries between so-called avant-garde and so-called self-taught. So, for instance, particularly notable in this exhibition that she curated in 1988 called Singulier, Brut ou Naïf. is actually the question mark, right? The point of the exhibition was to question all these labels, so singulier, singular art, brut or naive, and to promote a kind of motto or a catchphrase that she defined as just art without borders. So kind of denouncing these different kind of labels, and we could of course add more to the list, as kind of insufficient. And you know, contrary to that, she specifically art brut was actually one of her main targets. Contrary to that, she promoted a kind of inclusive vision of art that would include both, for instance, here paintings by Rubens Gerschmann, major kind of proponent of the Brazilian avant-garde, and anonymous craftsmanship, ex-photos from Brazil. And in the few kind of remaining minutes, I want to focus on a few examples of artists who were kind of working directly with Ceres Franco. So kind of emphasizing the fact that they were not in fact working in isolation, but in constant dialogue with Ceres Franco as this kind of art critic / curator figure, also mediating between Brazil and Europe. First figure, of course, that I want to mention is Chico Da Silva, because he's also included in the exhibition Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. And I thank Rodrigo for this picture from the actual exhibition. So Chico Da Silva, or Francisco Da Silva, was in fact first in touch with the Swiss painter and art critic Jean-Pierre Chablot's, but Ceres Franco worked with him very early on, in fact, and organized one of his first solo exhibitions in Paris in 1966, and kept kind of collecting his work, displaying his works all the way into 2012, where some of the works included in the Ceres Franco collection were exhibited at the Cartier Foundation. And I think took the embodiment of the epitome of this constant dialogue, and the fact that Chico Da Silva, like other popular artists, were not isolated, is, I think, you know, the fact that there was a specifically designed envelopes for Chico Da Silva. This one kind of serendipitously addressed to Ceres Franco herself. So I thought this piece of kind of archival document would be an interesting way to kind of illustrate these kind of constant links between popular artists and art critics, curators. And one of the most kind of spectacular works in the collection of Ceres Franco is this painting called Amazonian Fantasy. That is one of the kind of major works in the Ceres Franco collection. And another artist who I think should also be kind of remembered as being constantly in tune with Ceres Franco's curatorship is Chaibi Attalal. Chaibi Attalal was a Moroccan artist who started kind of producing works late in life on the basis of what she described as some kind of religious epiphany, basically. So her kind of figurative works, but with clear kind of abstract tendencies, where she described as having been kind of ordered or dictated by a kind of divine revelation. Ceres Franco organized her first solo exhibition in Paris in 1974, all the way to FIAC, so one of the first venues for contemporary art in the 1980s. And I would like to take maybe 30 seconds to unpack this image, because there's a lot going on in terms of kind of back and forth between art critics, curation, modernity. So we see that this is an article by Harry Laus, so major kind of Brazilian art critic, about Ceres Franco, talking about a show that she organized specifically for kind of women artists. So this is the image in the center, with a very kind of ironic, self-aware illustration, because we see Ceres Franco herself standing up to the right, with Carmen Miranda, who's like sitting down. Carmen Miranda being this kind of Brazilian star, like movie star and singer, and the a key kind of figure of some kind of over-the-top femininity that was embraced by the tropicalist movement, who really loved using the image of Carmen Miranda as some kind of pop art kind of icon, a little bit like Warhol and Marilyn Monroe, for instance. And we see that in this mix, or which is already a very kind of populated image, Shaibia Talal is depicted on the right-hand side as being kind of part in this intricately in this process of kind of artistic modernity. And we see here one of the kind of few archival images that we have of the exhibition opening of a solo show by Shaibia Talal. Shaibia is there to the right, and Ceres Franco right next to her. I wasn't able to identify the musician, in fact, so I would love to have suggestions as to who the musician might be. Just to conclude on Shaibia, I think her very distinctive painting style could be reminiscent of aspects of the Cobra movement, which might explain why Ceres Franco was strongly kind of interested in her work. And two other artists that I wanted to mention briefly, but won't have time to kind of delve into are Valdomiro De Deus, similarly kind of popular artist who is like in constant dialogue with Ceres Franco. We have abundant correspondence in the archives. And Eloy Blanco, artist from Brazil, also with like a strong kind of religious inspiration. And she was exhibited by Ceres Franco as well through various kind of intermediaries, including at the Triennial of Popular Art in Bratislava in '72. And for Valdomiro De Deus, I should mention that Anatol Jakovsky was one of the key kind of art critics and curators who were kind of missing link between Valdomiro De Deus and Ceres Franco. And we see here one example of the work by Eloy Blanco called Explosive Properties, which is also one of the kind of key artworks in the Ceres Franco collection. And so I think it's, I would love to see more examples also of this kind of constant correspondence, this kind of back and forth, sometimes with illustrations that we have in the archives. But I think this was already a very dense and rich presentation. So I'll have to stop here with just a few bibliographical recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raphael. And a reminder to our audience, we will have time at the end of each panel for question and answer sessions. So if you have questions for any of the speakers, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A at any point, and we'll get to it. Maybe one of you will be able to help us identify that musician. So please don't feel like you need to wait until the end to begin populating some of those questions. Next, thank you, Raphael. I will ask Adele Nelson to please join us. Adele is Assistant Professor of Art History and the Associate Director of the Center of Latin American Visual Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Nelson specializes in post-war and contemporary art of Latin America with a focus on Brazil, and her writings have appeared in Art Journal, Artologie, Art Margins, Modos, and various museum publications. And Adele, among numerous accomplishments, recently has a new book out, Forming Abstraction, Art and Institutions in Post-War Brazil. So thank you for being with us, Adele.
Thanks so much for having me and for the lovely introduction, Susanna and Rodrigo. Thank you. I'm honored to be here and participating in the dialogue around this important show. So what I'd like to do in my remarks today, which focus on the construction of Alfredo Volpi as the ultimate insider-outside artist in the Brazilian art world of Rio and Sao Paulo in the middle of the 20th century. And I'm drawing here on an essay in the catalog of the soon to open Volpi Popular exhibition at the Museo de Arte de São Paulo. I want to use this thinking, some of it, because my remarks will be brief, but this thinking about how Volpi is constructed as an insider-outsider artist to reflect on the historiographic context for why some audiences may have been surprised to find a painting by Volpi, a white artist canonized as part of the history of post-war abstraction in Brazil in the current fantastic exhibition at El Museo del Barrio, specifically this remarkable painting from circa 1943. Large scale, approximately 3.5 by 5 feet. It depicts an explicitly multiracial community marking a Catholic festival in a small seaside town. I will explore how the definition of Volpi in the 1950s as a singular artist and as proof of Brazil's homegrown modernity entailed the celebration of an ethnic working class whiteness and a centering of the city of São Paulo in the national story. Let me begin with an account of a crime. The National Exhibition of Concrete Art, which was its original venue, was at the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo at the end of 1956. It then traveled to Rio and was held in the art galleries at the Ministry of Education and Health. The show in both venues in São Paulo and Rio received extensive press coverage, including by the artists participating in the show themselves and the poets who staged events and published kind of copious text to accompany it. In its aftermath, in early 1957, an article in the Rio newspaper Jornal do Brasil appeared after the show had closed with Alfredo Volpi as its focus, illustrating his red and white concrete composition from 1956. And this work was included in the concrete art exhibition. You're seeing it here in the middle of the wall in one of the installation views in São Paulo. Volpi was born in Italy and emigrated with his family as a toddler to São Paulo, where he dropped out of school and worked as a craftsman, as a house painter, including to support his family, before later in middle age taking up fine art. The newspaper article dedicated to this painting does not touch on the debates about concrete art or Volpi's inclusion in the exhibition. Rather, it denounced the shoddy treatment of artworks at the government ministry and recounts step by step a theft undertaken as protest. The narrator, none other than eminent art critic and political activist Mario Pedrosa, informs the reader that he plans to give over his visual arts column to quote unquote a common citizen. And you see up top here a little note on the translation. So the word that Pedrosa uses throughout the essay is popular or nosso popular, which I've translated as our common citizen or a common citizen. So Pedrosa lavishes praise on this common citizen whose expeditiousness and intelligence allowed him to denounce this negligence by the state. The unlikely hero, readers are told, happened upon an unlocked entry to the ministry and walked into the galleries full of artworks strewn haphazardly. So he happened upon the show as it was de-installed. After witnessing the scene of quote unquote criminal neglect, the common citizen decided to remove an artwork by Volpi, the painting on the left. In clear view of the staff installing another exhibition, he stuck the canvas under his arm and walked out of the building via the front entrance. The thief/activist then took the painting to the office of the newspaper Jornal do Brasil for safekeeping, where the work remained at the time of Pedrosa's writing, awaiting its collection by its private owner. And the painting was not just featured prominently in the exhibition, but recurred throughout the press surrounding the show, including being illustrated in the de facto catalog that accompanied the show, which I'm showing you a spread of on the right. So Volpi was embraced by concrete artists in Rio and São Paulo as a kind of founding father and a figure, as I'll talk about a little bit more, that proved kind of a homegrown, autonomous source of abstraction among Brazilian artists. So returning to our crime tabloid, who was this mystery common citizen? An editor's note tells us that the man decided not to be identified or photographed and left the newspaper offices, returning to anonymity in the quote multitude. That Pedrosa gives us plenty of details that undercut the man's commonness. He described him as, quote, a Brazilian interested in art and well informed about avant-garde movements, unquote, and, quote, an obscure admirer of Volpi, end quote. Art historical knowledge then, as now, was assumed to be the domain of the privileged, and with a heavy wink, Pedrosa implies that an art world insider, perhaps he himself, undertook this stunt. The anecdote is played for laughs, with an art critic in a prestigious daily newspaper channeling a crime reporter at a tabloid. Yet the villain is never sufficiently identified. No politician, government minister, or even cultural manager is called out. Instead, the reader is encouraged to huff at the incompetence of the presumably working class, underpaid staff who had mishandled the artworks and witnessed the theft without intervening. I dwell on this story to offer a different vantage point into the complex status of Volpi as a celebrated fine artist who was an autodidact dedicated to vernacular culture. What I hope to do is foreground the contradictions in the story of Volpi rather than paint over those disjunctures. So a way of narrating Volpi's career that's quite commonplace is from figuration to abstraction. So as a story of modernism in and of itself. What the newspaper piece allows us to ask is this: could Volpi be an individual well-informed of avant-garde movements masquerading as our common citizen? For Pedrosa, certainly not. Volpi was the epitome of authenticity. Pedrosa celebrated the artist's identities as working class, immigrant, and self-taught. Later, in 6 months after the National Exhibition of Concrete Art, in 1957, Pedrosa mounted an extensive retrospective of Volpi's work at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, composed of 60 works from his earliest works in the 1920s to the present, and asserted in his essay that Volpi was the master of our age. Pedrosa claimed that Volpi was free from any influence from European art, an assertion that has persuasively been disputed by scholars from Sonia Sahlstein, Rodrigo Naves, and Lorenzo Mami, among others. Nevertheless, Pedrosa's Volpi was neither primitive, nor naive, nor modern, but something far superior in the critic's mind. He was an artisan turned artist, an artist unaffected by the trends of the art world, yet paradoxically understandable via art historical, stylistic, and chronological frameworks. Furthermore, Volpi's turn towards non-objective abstraction, beginning in the mid-1950s, was presented by Pedrosa and others as evidence of an autonomous trajectory for non-figuration in the country. As one of those young abstract artists put it, for us, young concrete artists, this is Valdemar Cordero speaking, Volpi is a crucial confirmation, the historically grounded proof, end quote. For the remainder of my short remarks today, let me zero in on how the projection and reception of Volpi in Rio in 1957 reveals the understudied racialized terms by which the artist was elevated and considered universal. And the interpretation of Volpi by Pedrosa in 57 casts a long shadow. It continues to be very foundational to how we still talk about Volpi today and the dynamics between popular artist and abstract artist. So from our common citizen and the true crime story turned institutional denouncement to his São Paulo neighborhood, Cambuci, possession and racialized identity were at the forefront of crafting Volpi's artistic persona. Insights from sociologists and historians about the intersections of ethnicity and class in determining what was permissible in elite discourse allow us to understand how Italian ethnicity was an exceptional case in mid-20th century Brazil. Art critics underlined Volpi's immigrant working class status. Pardon me, this is the neighborhood where Volpi lived much of his life that Pedrosa emphasizes, as I'll talk about. And here's a photograph of Volpi from 1970. So let me start that sentence over. Art critics underlined Volpi's Italian immigrant working class status and took part in a process of both resisting the status quo, where in theory, Volpi's class and ethnicity would have disqualified him from being a national representative. He was an immigrant, he was working class, he was Italian working class individuals were not yet integrated into a sense of elite whiteness. But what happens with Volpi in the mid-1950s, I argue, was key to the expansion of whiteness and Brazilianness to include non-elite Italian Brazilians. Implicit in the art and critical embrace of Volpi was not just a celebration of an ethnic working class whiteness, but also a centering of São Paulo in the national story. As Barbara Weinstein has illuminated, intellectual, economic, and political elites constructed the identity of the city and state of São Paulo in the first half of the 20th century as the righteous innovator, racially coded as white, leading forward a backward nation racially coded as Black. The crafting of Volpi as a singular genius was both a piece and in tension with this larger national and regional discourse, steeped in the myth of Brazil as a racial democracy free from race-based prejudice. Pedrosa left little to chance in 1957. Via his megaphone at the newspaper Jornal do Brasil, he published no less than 7 articles on Volpi in the span of 1 month. This coincided with multiple articles by other art critics and poets, Ferreira Goulart and Jaime Mauricio, and numerous public lectures and panel discussions staged at the museum. And I'm showing you images of artists at the opening, including Volpi there in the middle with a cigarette at mouth. And on the right is Mario Pedrosa giving a talk, it looks like with a bottle of wine on the table. Pedrosa had a long-established practice of centering artists he positioned as outliers, notably Alexander Calder and Paul Klee, as models for young abstract artists and as bulwarks against orthodoxy. Lauding Volpi also complemented Pedrosa's commitment to an expansive understanding of creativity and valorization of the art of non-artists, particularly mental health patients, which he wrote about since the late 1940s, and children, which he dedicated a book in 1954 to the art of children. But he viewed Volpi as both apart from this broader creative community, writing, quote, "You could say that he is one of those anonymous popular creators who rose above the rest," end quote. The Volpi that Pedrosa presented in Rio was not merely a Paulista or an Italian Brazilian, but an artist from Cambuci, a working class neighborhood established in São Paulo in the 19th century and identified with its Italian immigrant population in the mainstream imaginary. Pedrosa noted that the neighborhood had been spared, destruction in the name of modernization, which had happened to many neighborhoods across the city. And on the right, I'm showing you images of how São Paulo was transforming at rapid pace in the 50s into a city of skyscrapers and highways that we know today. And instead, Volpi's neighborhood maintained its 19th century and early 20th century low-rise buildings. Pedrosa also noted that before Volpi was a fine artist, he worked as a decorative interior painter and had benefited from the flourishing of his community, transforming from a working class to a lower middle class neighborhood where people built small palaces and Volpi would paint the interior murals. Cambuci and other neighborhoods considered Italian functioned as a very particular figure of nostalgia for whites in the southeast of the country. For a nation that experienced waves of European immigration and successive agricultural and industrial booms that continued to yield economic mobility and prosperity for whites across class identifications. Invisibilized in these narratives were the significant and long-standing Afro-descendant populations in these neighborhoods. Pedrosa's Cambuci was an idealized white ethnic enclave, rather than its reality as a multiracial, multi-class neighborhood. The latter, however, was the Cambusi that Volpi lived in. The artist's wife, Benita da Conceição Volpi, who went by the nickname Giudice, was Black, and together they had a biological child and 2 adopted children. This component of Volpi's life was absent from the photographic and textual records of the Museum of Modern Art Rio's exhibition in 1957, with Pedrosa briefly mentioning the artist's quote-unquote fine wife and their home full of adopted children, a cheerful daughter, and dogs and chickens. But in the copious photographs in the newspapers in Rio, we instead find Volpi smiling with a cigarette at lip or amongst art critics and other abstract artists. In other words, the image of Volpi in Rio in 1957 was as a celebrated white artist, a singular genius. It is possible that Volpi and his works were seen by some critics as a symbol of a more racially inclusive art world, in which the artist was connected to non-elite Brazilian life via his subjects and the materiality of his painting. He continues using tempera, even as he transitions to a more geometric abstract language, via his own modest background, his continued residency in a neighborhood with a working class identity, and his membership in a multiracial household. That said, Denise Ferreira da Silva's scholarship cautions us against accounts of interracial relationships as a de facto challenge to racism. Miscegenation was, after all, crucial to the myth of racial democracy. Moreover, Volpi's interracial marriage was met by bias by the art world and beyond, as Denise Matad has indicated. And his reception in 1957 and beyond minimized and bracketed his familial ties to non-whites. Above all, his life and career were read as evidence of the possibility of overcoming poverty via self-made mobility, an avenue blocked for many non-whites by discrimination. A notion that reoccurs in Pedrosa and others writing about Volpi, including Ferreira Goulart, is purity. These authors detail what they see as the universal, expressive, even ethical and spiritual force of Volpi's worldview, that they argue distills essential aspects of Brazilian existence.
Hi, everyone. Adele, I think you froze, but it seems like you're here, but maybe I could ask you to
Where did I freeze, Susanna?
let's see. You were talking about Ferreira Goulart.
Okay, just a minute ago then.
Yes.
Okay, thanks so much. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and if we could just be conscious of time so we can get to Victor. Thank you.
Okay, I am on my last paragraph. Okay, so what I was saying, apologies for the tech issue, is that a central term in the interpretation of Volpi was purity. And Ferreira Goulart dedicated a really revealing text to trying to understand whether it's appropriate to think of Volpi as a folk artist. He writes that for primitive painters like Héctor dos Plazeres, and I'm pairing him here with an artist that Goulart doesn't mention, but is in the El Museo show, José Bernardo Cardoso Jr., and José Antonio da Silva, as well as, and I'm pairing him here with Giannata, an artist in the show. He writes that for these artists, the canvas is, quote, a place where they show us certain things they have seen, imagined, or recorded. Their works, he says, were characterized by a profusion of details, whereas Volpi's was defined by an absence of details. And here, of course, he's talking about the later works, like the work on the right. Nevertheless, Goulart argues Volpi can be considered a popular painter because the matrices of his work are popular. quote, the forms and colors that we discover in the houses of the suburbs, the little tissue paper flags of our festivals, end quote. In this analysis, Volpi is an author creating transcendent artworks, and Placeres, Silva, and others are recorders of Black and regional subcultures. That Volpi did depict a specific vernacular culture bound by the architecture of his neighborhood and other select sites, including Catholic festivals, and more broadly by his ethnicity, class, gender, and migration, is both stated and sublimated. The artist's imaginary is read by predominantly white critics as universal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adele. Really fascinating. And again, I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So please, if you have questions for Adele, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to introduce Viktor Espinosa, our third speaker on this first panel. Viktor is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the Ohio State University, Newark. A sociologist specializing in the intersection of art and migration, he is the author of El Dilema del Retorno, Migración, Género y Pertenencia en un Contexto Transnacional, and Martin Ramirez, Framing His Life and Art, published in Spanish as Martin Ramirez, Arte, Migración y Locura. And I think even that is a rich point of discussion, Viktor, to talk about the two different titles of this book. But I think we'll save that to discussion, and without further notice, I invite you to share your screen and teach us about Martin Ramirez. I believe you're on mute, so making sure you have that.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, and it's an honor for me to be here. And thank you for organizing this amazing exhibition. So let me try to find my PowerPoint. It was here a couple seconds ago. Let me see. Let me try again. So I was saying that thank you for your invitation. It's an honor for me to be here. One of this show includes focuses in four popular artists, and one of them is Martin Ramirez. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of my research. I published a book a couple years ago in 2015 in the English version, and in 2019 it was translated into Spanish. So most of the information I am sharing with you today is coming from this book. Martin Ramirez was a Mexican immigrant, worker in California. He migrated in 1925. But in 1931, he was institutionalized in a state hospital in California. It was in the second institution where Ramirez produced most of the work that exists today, around between 1935 to 1963. The first information I found about Ramirez working inside the institutions came from a very small note by one of the doctors, and it was in 1935. Most of the art Ramirez produced was not preserved. The entire work that he produced in the first hospital, in the Stockton State Hospital, between 1935 and 1948, was not preserved. When he was transferred to the Weed State Hospital, a professor of art and psychology met Ramirez there in 1948. And he is one of the ones who are in charge of preserving some of the most Ramirez work that we have today. It's around 350 pieces. And later in his life, and Ramirez also, he never stopped working. Even some of his drawings were destroyed by the staff. A second very important actor in this story met Ramirez, and he was in charge of preserving most of the Ramirez work that he did in the last years of his life, and around 150 pieces. This show includes some of the most some of the best examples of Ramirez work. He drew a lot of trains. We believe are highly connected because his migration from Mexico to the United States was being trained. And then he has many versions of these what we call this jinete that we believe is connected with a war in Mexico, what we call the Cristero Rebellion that was in the late 1920s. And Ramirez was not there, but we know that he received information about the conflict to family letters and to friends that were migrating to the area and coming to the United States because of the conflict. He also, one of the characteristics of Ramirez's work is the strong presence of his lines. And over the years, he became more, I don't say interested, but his art became more, let's say, more abstract. Another way to say this, he put more emphasis in the lines and less in the narrative of his work. So most of the work he produced later in his life is mostly lines. And he also did a lot of collages where he used sources from magazines to connect his memories back in Mexico, but also to integrate those into the drawing. So he was using collages, the pieces from magazines to do collages, but also to draw the anatomy of animals and other elements of his art. So this exhibition is really important in Ramirez's trajectory. Why? Because it's unique in many ways. This is the first time that Ramirez included an exhibition of these characteristics. So what I'm going to do here in my presentation is to give some sense of how Ramirez was recognized over the years, and then to put this exhibition in context. Ramirez have achieved a lot of visibility in the art world, and the purpose of my presentation is do a very quick, a very fast tour to how Ramirez was recognized inside the art world. Yeah? So I found that we can buy Ramirez recognition in 3 different stages. So I'm going to move really fast in those 3 stages, and I would like to concentrate in my last slides where we can open some discussions here in our conversation. Yeah. So the first stage, the stage of Ramirez recognition began when he was introduced to the art world. And it was in 1952 when he had his first solo exhibition. Something very important to keep to remember is Ramirez had 5 solo exhibitions in his lifetime and exhibitions of psychotic art. Something also very important to know is that Ramirez was never invited to any of his shows, nor was his name included in the exhibition labels and not in the reviews done by the press. Ramirez was only identified as a schizophrenic agent Mexican. So let me move very fast to my slides until I reach the second stage of his recognition. We don't have much information about the first Ramirez exhibition. There is, sadly, we don't have photos of the installation, but I found some correspondence between the director of the first gallery who showed Ramirez art in 1952, Don R. Virrell, and he was a designer, and also he liked to collect Mexican art. So he was fascinated by Ramirez's work. I interviewed Virrell in 2003, almost 50 years after he did the first Ramirez show, and he still remembered very well all the elements that were very attractive to him from Ramirez art. This is the second show by Ramirez in 1954 at the Mill College Museum of Art. This show was reviewed by basically every single paper in the area, in the San Francisco area. And it was the first time that one of Ramirez's pieces was included in a reproduction of Ramirez as was included in the press. And by the title of the article that behind this piece, you can see that Ramirez was attracting a lot of attention in the area. I work in the archives of the Mill College of Art, and I was able to study the attendance of the shows in those years, and Ramirez was the most attended show in those years at this gallery. Something important to mention here is when Alfred Neumayer organized this exhibition in the Mill College of Art, he intentionally also selected some drawings for the San Francisco Museum of Art with some of the most important names from Mexico, including Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and he organized together with Ramirez exhibition in the gallery behind some drawings by Mexican masters. What is very interesting, of course, is that for this presentation is that Ramirez attract more attention than the exhibition of the Mexican masters. Here you have more examples about how Tarmopasto, the professor who collected his art in the 1950s, he organized a couple of exhibitions in the area. He also tried to organize a show of Ramirez at the MoMA. He sent some files there, but it's not very, we don't know if they had any interest in the exhibition or not, but they didn't do anything. He also sent files to the Guggenheim. They were very interested about Ramirez's art, and they were planning to have an exhibition in the 1950s, 1960s about a show and comparing artists influenced by art done by mentally ill people, but the show was never done. Ramirez was also included in an exhibition in the first collective exhibition of psychotic art in the West Coast. And it was in this year, 1954, when I believe Ramirez, not the last time that this label was used with him, but it was one of the most important shows in his life. Then it was another show in the early 1960s at the Syracuse University, where again, the label of psychotic artist was used again. And what I call the second stage of recognition is when Ramirez, for the first time, is including exhibitions where his name is used for the first time, and also they left behind this psychotic art label. And the first example of this was in 1970 at the San Francisco Art Institute, when Ramirez included a collective show about American primitives and naives. So this is the first time that Ramirez now is being classified as a naive artist. And then in the 1970s is when Ramirez is introduced into the art market in Chicago and New York. Something very interesting here is that when Phyllis Kine organized the first Ramirez show in New York, the entire exhibition was sold out. It was a huge succeed. It was a very successful exhibition in the Phyllis Kine gallery. Ramirez was introduced into the market now with a new label. This ad from the magazine Art in America, where Phyllis Kine advertised the first Ramirez show in New York, is introducing him as a contemporary American naive. And if we look at the reviews done in the press in those years, some of the most influential art critics, they were highly impressed by Ramirez's art, and every one of them classified Ramirez as a naive artist. Of course, when the quotation marks already indicates that the problem was that they didn't have any other label better to classify his art, yeah? And then at the end of the 1970s, Ramirez is included in one of the most spectacular exhibitions and when the label outsider artist is used for the first time. It was in 1979 in London. Something very interesting about the show. There are many things that we can discuss about the show, but it was a breaking point in the history of Ramirez. Something amazing in this show, for example, is that the curators decided to use black walls in the exhibition. It was something very shocking for the institution and also for the people who went to see the show. Something also very interesting about this moment is in the archive of this gallery, there is this list of the different labels or different ways that the two curators in charge of this show was trying to call this exhibition. Yeah, the show was curated by Viktor Musgraff, who was somebody very interested in avant-garde art. He was, for example, one of the producers of a film made by Yoko Ono. And the second curator, Roger Cardinal, he is the author of the book that now is very popular in the field of outsider art, where he used the label outsider art to translate the Chant Buffet notion of art broad. But something very interesting about this list is all the difficulties they were having to frame or to label the art they were presenting. Something also very interesting, for example, is maybe it was Royal Cardinal, who underlined two labels. One is after surrealism and beyond surrealism, because Cardinal was a scholar that highly interested in this kind of artistic movement. At the end of the day, both curators decided to use the same label that Cardinal had been using in his book, and the exhibition was called Outsiders. But I believe it's very interesting the way you can see all the different labels that were used in this exhibition, or the labels they were trying to use to frame this exhibition. So 1979 was the breaking point in the history of Ramirez, because this is when he is for the first time labeled as an outsider. This label was used for the first time in the United States by Elsa Longhauser at the Moore College of Design in Philadelphia, and we don't have any photos of the installation. This is the cover of the catalog, but this is the first time that Ramirez had a retrospective, and very important art critics and write about Ramirez for this book. So he is introduced to the American audience as a typical example of an outsider. 1980s is also the first time that Ramirez is included in an exhibition of Hispanic art in the United States. This exhibition is highly controversial. In this exhibition, for example, also Ramirez showed the space with Gregorio Marsan, who was also included in this exhibition at the Museo del Barrio. This exhibition was controversial for many different sectors of the society and the art world. The Chicano Latino community was not very happy to include a psychotic artist as the emblem of this show. So for them, for the artists that included in this show that were more like a contemporary artists, they were not very happy that if they wanted to take seriously about their work, and then being mixed with artists that they were called primitive, and also with that artistic training like Martin Ramirez, and even with psychological problems. In the same 1980s, also Mexico decides to organize what was at the point the largest Ramirez exhibition today. At that time, it was in 1989 at the Centro Cultural Arte Contemporáneo, and again, the exhibition broke attendance records. And we are talking about a museum that before had exhibitions about Dalí and Picasso in the same place, and Ramirez was one of the most popular shows in that museum. This is the first time that Ramirez is shown together with popular art or folk art from Mexico. The only problem with this is that they were trying to not to create a dialogue between Ramirez art and those pieces. What we were looking for was trying to show the possible Ramirez background or possible Ramirez influence in his art. This is something we can discuss later in the conversation. The show was very highly successful because they used many different ways to advertise the show in Mexico. They did a special of 1 hour in the national television. They were passing ads almost every hour in two of the most important TV channels, because the corporation that controlled those TV channels were also the owner of the museum where Ramirez had this show. Yeah. 1990s starts with a new time for Martin Ramirez. Now his presence has spread over the mainstream, and this show became, according with my research, became the show that paved the way to Ramirez into the mainstream. Parallel Vision was opened in the Los Angeles County Museum in 1992. Went to the Museo de la Reina Sofía in Madrid, and Ramirez 5-6 Ramirez drawings were included in a show that also shared the walls with people like Dalí, like Paul Klee, like Hans Bellmer, but in this case, I believe the show was trying to make a distinction between the two groups. But at the same time, making the distinction about untrained and trained artists, or maybe sane and unsane artists, the show, something that the show made was, it was possible to see the formal similarities between the two artistic expressions.
Victor, I'm
Yes.
very sorry to interrupt. Can we give you like a minute warning so that we have
Yes,
some
yeah,
time?
yeah. I'm going to start with this. This is the second stage of Ramirez recognition, and ends with the 2000 very successful again 2007 exhibition in New York. This exhibition went to many different places in the United States, and is what I believe is the turning point between now Ramirez now being assimilated into the mainstream. I have 3 examples of this in my slides. The first one is Ramirez at the Museo de la Reina Sofia. One of the Ramirez pieces is acquired by the MoMA and is already an exhibition. And then Ramirez opens a new Institute for Contemporary Art in Los Angeles in 2017. And finally, somebody already asked a question about this. Ramirez was included in a very recent exhibition in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So what I would like to suggest in my last 2 or 3 minutes that I still have is what I found in my research is that there are intention 3 different ways to see his art. For some actors and discourses in the art world, Ramirez is a unique expression with any present of tradition. Ramirez have also, his art has been seen also as something creating the margins of modernism. And also Ramirez is part of, somebody believe that, Ramirez is part of a parallel, but a separate field in contemporary art. So what I believe is that this notion of being in this parallel, or I think I jumped one of the slides, and some curators argue that Ramirez, for example, is in this parallel universe between contemporary art and outsider art. But Lynn Cook have observed very, very interestingly that in some moments, those 2 worlds intersect, and is what she calls the parallaxes. But the question for me is if this contact, this parallaxes moment in these 2 different fields means that really Ramirez and many other artists, situation is changing in the art world, where it's just the way you are looking, is the way you are standing and looking at this stuff. And this opened the questions for me because and my research, because what I believe is in Ramirez's case, and in the case of many other popular artists, or what they call outsider artists, is a tension between assimilating the art itself, but at the same time keeping a distance with the creators. You know what I mean? They are assimilating the artwork at the same time they are having problems to assimilate the artists themselves. And this is something that we can maybe discuss today. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. That was great. And I'd like to call Raphael and Adele back and thank all of you. I know we are short on time, but I think we'll be able to take at least 5 or 6 minutes before we transition to the next panel. But I really wanted to thank you all firstly because Adele and Victor, I think you tackled 2 of the artists that are perhaps the most well-known in the exhibition, Alfredo Volpi, although not necessarily for this particular, earlier work, so to speak, that we're featuring. And then, of course, Victor with Martin Ramirez, who I think perhaps is the most mainstream. Maybe we can talk about that in a minute and away from our show. And then Raphael, on the other hand, I think you brought in a figure who is not very well known at all, not a household name, as you mentioned. I was very obviously struck by the fact that we all talked about these terms and labels. Raphael, I love you also pointing out how Ceres Franco was in a way so ahead of her time with that question mark. I think now we are all incredibly and for good reason questioning of labels. And I think just to start, I want to end maybe where you ended, Victor, on this idea of assimilation and how we can think of how labels can be used as a form of assimilation, and how, in the case of the artists under discussion, who as immigrants, or in the case of Ceres Franco, as someone who is moving between locations, how can we think of these terms as our, I mean, are we looking for assimilation with these terms, or do we want to maintain some of the frictions? And whoever wants to pick up on that, I invite you to jump right in, since we don't have tons of time.
I would like to pass the word to Raphael because he had less time than us to express his ideas. So maybe this is like something like a justice right now here.
Sure. I mean, so just to rephrase your question, it was basically what to do with disabled, whether we should kind of do away with them entirely or maintain some kind of distinction, if I understood correctly.
Yes, I mean, even within our own show, I think we play with the friction of even the thematics.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, what I really liked about the Ceres Franco position, as far as I could kind of reconstruct it based on archival documents and kind of talking with her, was that she was maintaining strong contextual elements. She would make sure to give kind of comprehensive details about the artist's kind of backgrounds, but also kind of insisting on connections between various artists she was exhibiting and not distinctions. So she would, emphasize, I don't know, the fact that Koenig Beverloo had been part of a Cobra group, which has like an important part in the history of 20th century art. But she would also kind of, and she would emphasize, the background of Valdomiro De Deus, for instance, or Chico Da Silva, but she would exhibit them on equal footing as artists she was championing, basically. So that it was her way of doing it. She had a very kind of neat way of kind of introducing these artists with a label Ceres Franco Presents, like Alfred Hitchcock in his series, it's like Alfred Hitchcock Presents. So like it was like her way, and then all of these artworks were exhibited on absolute equal footing. And I thought it was a neat way of doing it, kind of strong contextual elements, but absolutely no discrimination based on where people were coming from or like their background.
Yeah, I think that's this. The tension between biography as being an integral to context, but not overemphasizing. I think that sort of over-the-top exaggeration of a Carmen Miranda is like a perfect example of that. Victor and Adele, again, I know we have just like 1 minute, but Adele, I was really struck. You point out how someone like Volpi, whose work we could say moves from figuration to abstraction, and how that fits very neatly in like the traditional Western view of modernism and its trajectory. But Victor, you brought the abstract nature of Martin Ramirez's work. You brought that up, and I'm curious to ask you about that aspect, and how do you think that is may or may not also play out, and how he fits easily or not into some of these categories, like contemporary versus naive or
Yeah, what I see by, I am not an art critic, and I am not an art historian. So what I did in my book is to follow how art critics and people in the inside our world, they were seeing his art. And they were highly attracted by this abstract appearance of his drawings. If you remove from Ramirez art all the figurative elements and just leave the lines, this is where relies most of his power. And this is what has been very attractive for many people. And this is not a coincidence that the piece that was acquired by the MoMA is one of the most abstract pieces in Ramirez art, because the train easily melt into all these designs. So it's a wonderful piece, and it's a very good example of that. So yeah, this element is what has made Ramirez very attractive to many collectors, museums, curators. Yeah.
And I mean, Susanna, just on the question of assimilation and sort of the tension of terms, I mean, one of the things that I'm still thinking through is like in the ascendancy of Volpi's estimation among abstract artists, a lot of abstract practice in Brazil in the mid 50s is popular artists, so-called popular artists, or they were described as primitive artists in the art scene at the time, are being included in exhibitions like Grupo Frente's exhibitions. Front group includes Elisa Martins da Silveira. But by the National Exhibition of Concrete Art, those popular artists are excluded, these explicitly figurative artists depicting vernacular culture, and instead Volpi stands in for that place, and it's abstract practice that stands in for that place. And so I think like the quote that I cited from Pedroza, that he's a popular artist that rose above the rest, sort of encapsulates it all, right? He comes to stand in for some reference to the vernacular and to non-elite culture, but in a way that's very safe and kind of still totally tethered to European modernism.
Yeah. Thank you all. I mean, I have so many more questions for you all, I think, but I wanted to give you all voice. Thank you again for presenting so much. I think I might just leave a teaser, something I wanted to ask Victor, but maybe I'll just share it out to the audience, is that we are also guilty of creating a new term in the case of Martin Ramirez specifically, and that we are grouping him alongside some of the artists that I brought up in my intro, Gregorio Marsan, Eloy Blanco, as Latinx pioneers. So maybe we can talk later, Victor, about that. But again, I wanted to be upfront with you all and with our audience, and maybe that we can talk about it in the chat, since we don't have time to talk about it in this virtual discussion. So I think with that, again, thank you so much. I am going to turn it over to panel 2. We're going to have maybe just a brief interlude so that we can stay as close to time as possible. But thank you all again. We really appreciate your insight and participation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, Rodrigo.
Hi, can you all see me?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. I'm sorry, I had a funny display selection here, so I was not sure. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to those who've been joining us since the beginning of the program. And for those who have not, my name is Rodrigo Moura. I'm the Chief Curator at El Museu, and today is my big privilege to be presenting our second panel for our virtual symposium around Popular Painters and Other Visionaries, our current exhibition that closes this weekend in the museum's galleries. So I would like to first do like a quick presentation. So I'll try to share my screen here and let's see if this works. Yes, thank you. Today is sexta-feira de Carnaval, no, it's Carnival today. So for those of Carnival, é voé. And I think this is it's a good moment to start. I would like to just share a little bit of my background and where did I come from to do this propose this exhibition, to propose this research for El Museo. I'm having a hard time just, yeah, this is better. Just prior of joining El Museo in between 2016 and somehow dovetailing on some of the considerations around Brazilian's modern process in the visual arts shared by our colleague Adele Nelson and as well Raphael Konig. And big thanks for everybody for the presentations in the previous panel. But prior of joining El Museo as its chief curator in 2009, I was in an adjunct position at Museo de Arte in São Paulo as adjunct curator of Brazilian art, where I worked in 3 exhibitions. I mean, I work in more, but 3 exhibitions where the term popular was used. And those exhibitions, Portinari Popular and Agostinho Batista de Freitas, São Paulo, both in 2006, and Janira in Picture in Brazil in 2019, my last project in the museum. So on these 3 shows, co-curated with different colleagues from the museum, we somehow referred back to a notion that was important to the creation of the Museo de Arte de São Paulo back in the late 40s and early 50s, or in its original conception by Pietro Maria Bardi, the idea of the museum without adjectives. So the idea of museum of art, that it's not a museum of fine art, a museum of decorative art, or a museum of modern art, but it's a museum of art at large, thus a museum without adjectives. So in the process of doing this, we revisited some artists who were like staple names or like very identifiable names in Brazilian art history, such as Portinari, Cândido Portinari, trying to see a recurrence of popular tropes throughout his work, and these are the catalog covers. Agostinho Batista de Freitas, a painter, self-taught, considered self-taught painter, with also strong ties with MASP, where he also worked as an electrician before having his first solo show there in 1953. And Janira da Mota Silva, modern Brazilian artist working in Rio between the 1940s and the 1970s. So these are some of the projects that I worked on at MASP. And also a lot of these projects were also presented in the context of reconsidering racial relations in the context of Brazilian visual art history and visual art at large. So perhaps I could just use this like to segue into Popular Painters itself, some of the installation views here. I apologize for my broken and quick English, dear interpreters. I'll try to be more mindful of that. But where we see some of the curatorial strategies that we as curators have been proposing for Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. On the left here, we have a painting by Rafael Bosses de Oliveira, another artist that was present in these early years, self-taught artist from Bahia, also a candomblé practitioner and priest, actually, who used to create very beautiful representations of the orishas to adorn, to decorate his ritual sites in Salvador, donated by the artist himself to MASP in 1953, I believe, paired with 3 paintings from different gifts to El Museo of the Haitian School of Painting. So this kind of both formal and iconographic associations that we try to create in the show. Another one that was, it's in the same space where we have Minnie Evans, Louisiane Saint Florent, and Chelo Gonzalez Amezcua, 3 visionaries, women visionaries of color, painters of color, working in different parts of the Americas, where again we try to create this connections between the works, both on a formal and on an iconographic level. Another example of an artist that I think it's important to mention just in this very brief presentation here, I'm trying to be very mindful of time, is Andrés Curuchiche, a Mayan artist based in San Juan de Comalapa in Guatemala, with these wonderful presentations or representations of street scenes, festivals, so where his indigenous ancestry as well as a syncretic religious manifestations appear in a very interesting oil painting technique, akin both to traveler artists or, you know, this idea of creating visions of the new world, and as well as the, you know, clothing and decorations and patterns of the syncretic indigenous Catholic, in this case, San Juan, St. John's procession or altars or I'm going to try to be a little briefer here. So that brings us on the same section, inside, outside, to the works. Just going to read real quick. The section can be classified as genre paintings. They depict figures engaged in ordinary work or leisure activities or in indoor spaces. Although these paintings could be read in relation to classical European art history, specifically Dutch interior paintings, we can add a group portrait here. We brought them together here because they include references to the artist's biographies as well as a sense of belonging within larger social groups. The first 6 paintings are by 3 artists from the African diaspora, the Americas, and the Caribbean: Horace Pippin, Heitor dos Prazeres, and Misuse Stefan, working respectively in the United States, Brazil, and Haiti. These artists share a working class background as well as a refined narrative vein in their compositions, exhibited alongside one another for the first time. These artists form a triad of Black modern painters who are considered key figures within their contexts. The title of the section, Inside, Outside, refers to both interior, exterior scenes, and this status conferred to the artists whose contribution to art history have been somehow overlooked, leading to the problematic use of the term outsider in reference to their work. So real briefly showing the 2 Pippins in the show, the 2 Misuse Stefans in the exhibition, and the 2 Heitor dos Prazeres in the exhibition. Glad to return to the slides if needed during the discussion. These are screen grabs from the website, the previous iteration of the show. So we had actually other paintings in the constellation of works by these 3 artists, especially the 2 the Prazeres and the Pippin here. So the original juxtapositions we proposed, and the domino players by Pippin from the Phillips collection. And perhaps I just put this slide here of Renaissance in Haiti, the book by Selden Rodman, Popular Painters in the Black Republic, a classic point of interpretation and introduction of the phenomenon of the Haiti painters in the mid-century. And this may be like a good point for me to introduce our first panelists. Thank you so much, the 3 of you. I'm very excited for your presentations. And Monahan is an independent scholar based in New York City. She focuses her research on modern and contemporary art, and her recent publications include the books Horace Pippin, American Modern, Yale 2020, and Faith Ringgold Dye, MoMA 19, the technical art history study of Pippin's painting, The Lady of the Lake, that she co-published with conservators at the Met, won an award from the Association of Art Museum Curators in 2018, and her work being supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Phillips Collection, and the Mellon Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today. And so without further notice or ado, please join us, and thanks again.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. So So thank you very much for this, for the introduction and the invitation, Rodrigo and Susanna, to be part of this conversation about such a fascinating exhibition, and for the opportunity to include Pippin in that conversation. Today, I'm going to use two paintings in the show now, and actually, in a way, one that was in the online show as well, to triangulate his position in the contemporary art world, of which he was an integral part. And I'll conclude by highlighting a Caribbean dimension of his international reception that, you know, for most of his career was localized in Europe. But first, a few words about the terms under which he first came to public acclaim. Pippin began painting in 1930 at the age of 42. By his untimely death 16 years later, he had almost 100 national and international exhibitions to his credit, many of which had multiple venues, a roster of influential public and private collectors, a monograph underway, which is a subject to which I will return, and a very few of his roughly 140 works left unsold. And that record qualifies him among the most successful painters of his day, black or white, as indicated by his place on Ad Reinhardt's, famous tree of American modernism. And I've circled him in blue so that you can pick him out. His dramatic trajectory was rooted in an international fascination between the world wars with self-taught artists who were championed for marrying flat abstract forms and homey subjects. This may be well-trod ground for you. Their proponents saw the combination as a gateway to modernism for audiences suspicious of avant-garde styles and politics. And the Museum of Modern Art was particularly influential in this vein, with several notable acquisitions and exhibitions around 1940, including the landmark survey, Masters of Popular Painting, Modern Primitives of Europe and America, which introduced Pippin to a national audience in 1938. Building on the art world designation primitive to describe work free of the linear perspective and naturalistic modeling characteristic of the Western tradition since the Renaissance, the label modern primitive and its correlate artist of the people were coined to position a diverse cohort of contemporary artists in the United States and Europe, who were almost entirely white, in a genealogy that reached back through the French primitive Henri Rousseau, and that is his boy on the rocks on the left, who was a patron saint in this moment to all modernists and modern primitive promoters alike. And to a host of antecedents, including, say, 14th century Italian painting, which you see represented in the middle, and 14th century carving on Rapa Nui, which you see on the right. And really the sources were incredibly diverse, and so these are just examples. Given the whiteness of this field of modern primitives, it is important to note that the category was unusual, if not unique, at the time for recognizing Black artists like Pippin on par, more or less, with their European and European American counterparts, who were mostly, if not exclusively, immigrants or children of immigrants, from which created a very populist political character to this project that intersected with anti-fascist politics in Europe at the time. Moreover, the designation artist of the people cast these practitioners as a socially representative, not marginal or outsider. And the borders of that category were quite porous at the time. Celebrated modern primitives, including John Kane, who was the first sort of American self-taught artist to make a splash in the 1920s. Horace Pippin, as we're discussing, and Jacob Lawrence, who may come up elsewhere in this conversation, quickly achieved crossover success as contemporary artists, full stop. And Lawrence shed the self-taught label entirely by the late 1940s, when the whole category fell out of favor in the United States. To be sure, Pippin and Lawrence also benefited from mounting attention to Negro art as the country promoted a heterogeneous model of US identity in the interest of national unity before and during World War II. Folk had a slightly different valence in this context because the concept had been a touchstone in the discourse of Black American identity since at least W.B.E. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk of 1903, and central to discussions of Black aesthetics since Alain Locke started encouraging new Negro artists to take inspiration from African and Black vernacular traditions in the 1920s. Pippin's fusion of folk and fine would seem to fit that prescription perfectly. As the largest and second to last installment of 7 cotton field paintings that fueled Pippin's so-called discovery and celebrity, this one, Cabin in the Cotton, 1944, depicts the quintessential landscape of Black folk as represented in Du Bois' popular culture and documentary photography of the period. Yet the painting's idyllic depiction of respite at day's end is difficult to square with the bleak realities of cotton farming that Pippin reproduced elsewhere, including these 2 paintings. Old King Cotton, which you see on the left, was commissioned by Vogue magazine in 1944, essentially the same moment as the painting in the Élysées show, and depicts tattered cotton workers, and I would direct your attention to the hem of the man's pants, supervised by a woman in what appears to be an antebellum costume of some ilk. And on the right, you see Old Black Joe, which is the painting that was in the online version of this show, which was commissioned for a national advertising campaign in 1943. And that's how you see it represented here, which depicts an enslaved man calling to loved ones in the afterlife. It's based on a Stephen Foster song. The pair of paintings bracketed Cabin in the Cotton on the checklist of Pippin's second solo exhibition in New York at Edith Halpern's prestigious downtown gallery. And it's tempting to think that, you know, that checklist represented the gallery installation as well. It's also tempting in that case to think that this painting, this kind of bucolic scene of cotton farming, which bears, you know, no relationship to the reality, is actually a representation of Joe's deceased loved ones who are awaiting him in a rustic paradisical afterlife. This combination of, you know, depictions of cotton, which first of all demonstrated to the, you know, at the exhibition audience, Pippin's enormous national popularity, also complicates any straightforward reading of his cotton imagery, you know, because, you know, it ranges from depressing and oppressive to fantastically peaceful. The next work in the show, I should say, gotten ahead of myself, my apologies. Enthusiastic critics have probably misread Pippin's cotton paintings as nostalgic, all of them. These 2, you know, especially Old Black Joe would not have been represented as an advertisement if people realized how phenomenally depressing it really was, and thus bound his professional reputation to a subject at the epicenter of Black exploitation in the United States. And it seems unlikely that this coincidence, you know, had nothing to do with the fact that he was developing this body of work as he was negotiating his increasing demand for his own artistic labor. And that demand, that appetite, was whetted partly by the success of these cotton paintings. So the positive feedback loop rested on groundless assumptions about his supposed autobiographical connection to this subject matter. In fact, he never lived in the South. He had no direct experience of cotton farming, except perhaps as a visitor, you know, on a vacation. And moreover, these assumptions reached further, leveraging his cotton imagery to imply or assert, in some cases, a sentimental attachment among Black people to life in the South that, you know, was pointedly contradicted by their mass exodus from that same area in that moment through the Great Migration. This painting was purchased by stockbroker and collector Roy Neuberger, of the Neuberger Museum, SUNY purchase, and on the second day of the show. So it was immediately taken up. And later that year, he sent it to the Carnegie Institute's annual exhibition, where it competed against, examples of contemporary art from around the country, and took fourth honorable mention. And the review for that show in the New York Times marks Pippin's distance from, this category of, self-taught, naive, whatever, you want to use. And I'll just read it, an excerpt, which is, that Pippin's brush possesses plenty of power need scarcely be argued. It seems often to possess, too, more downright technical cunning than a true primitive is supposed to know anything about. Okay, so now, the next year, so 1945, Pippin painted The Den, this painting, as a gift for Jane Kendall Mason Hamilton, who eventually owned 9 of his works. The pair met around 1943 after both had been making headlines for years, he as an artist and she as a debutante, socialite, hostess, fashion plate, sportswoman, and bon vivant. These are just 2 of many images of her. She was a famous beauty. And she had recently moved to Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is where Pippin lived, after years in Cuba, where she had used her fabulous home. And this is a photograph of the interior. It's now the Canadian embassy, which was outfitted with an art studio for her and also an art collection to host a who's who of friends like Isamu Noguchi, and that is his sculpture of her, his bust of her on the right, who carved that sculpture, and Ernest Hemingway, who wrote her into his fiction. She also promoted Cuban arts and crafts by founding the Juanita shop in Havana to sell high-end local handwork to deep-pocketed tourists, by organizing crafts classes for Cuban children, and by sponsoring the supposed autodidact Gabriel Castaño Morales for a year's work in Trinidad, Cuba, and then for an exhibition in New York in 1933. So here's the clipping about that exhibition, and then 2 examples of Castaño's work from Trinidad, which she acquired. They apparently are still, in her house in Cuba. But so just to give you a sense of what it looked like. The degree to which he's self-taught, I think, is a bit of an open question, but that is how he was promoted. When she landed in Pennsylvania, almost a decade after that show, she was primed by these Cuban experiences to appreciate the art star in her new backyard. The Den represents essentially a trophy room in her colonial farmhouse, which was reputed to have hosted George Washington's army. Described at the time as a pine-paneled library, the room would have been the logical home for the drafts and galley proofs that Hemingway had been sending her for years. The decor centered on animal skins, as you can see in both the photograph and the painting. She reportedly shot the lion herself on safari in 1935, or witnessed someone in her party do so. And the leopard chairs were almost certainly upholstered in pelts that she had received as a gift in 1932. The skins were trophies on another level as well, because she acquired them via her romance. Oh, that's her on safari, and via her romance with big game hunter Richard Cooper. That's her with him on the right. And so to the extent that she left this incredibly glamorous and exciting life behind with her new marriage and moved to Chester County, the Den was a portal to an exotic past at considerable remove from her new, more staid situation. And the room was also a trophy room for Pippin, because his work hung 2 of his paintings in the space. And in fact, I'll point out, if you see the little rectangle to the right, to the left of the fireplace, sort of above the leopard chair, that is his self-portrait, the one that I opened my lecture with, or remarks with. And then another painting you cannot see in this space called Sleepers were both installed in space. And obviously Pippin's, access to this space was a kind of trophy also, his special friendship with her that would have given him time and in this interior. Reportedly, Pippin made the den for Hamilton as a birthday surprise. And this gift to a key collector proves him to be socially adept, savvy about his market, and apparently at ease with those of wealth and privilege. And those attributes are typical of those who navigate the art world with aplomb, and even more evidence of his, essentially insider position. I'll just conclude with a quick word about the monograph underway at his death. Selden Rodman, whom Rodrigo already mentioned, wrote Horace Pippin, a Negro Painter in America, the year after Pippin died. He planned it while Pippin was still alive, but had to complete it after his death. And it was the first such publication devoted to a Black American artist, period. And in adding Popular Painters of Haiti to the text in which he positions Pippin in an international context, Rodman elaborated a diasporic context for the painter that's, in line with the museum, El Museo's exhibition that you've organized. And I'll leave it there. I don't want to run over, but I'm happy to talk about Pippin anytime, and certainly after, when we take questions.
Thank you so much, and that was fascinating. So on to Bruno's presentation. Bruno Pinero, a PhD candidate at the State University of Campinas, Unicamp, where he studies the trajectories of Brazilian Black modernist painters and sculptors. His dissertation work is funded by FAPESP, the research foundation of the state of São Paulo. His research advisor, Silvana Rubino, and his dissertation work is, I'm repeating myself, I apologize. During the year of 2020, Bruno was a visiting scholar at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, working under the supervision of Professor Edward J. Sullivan. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bruno.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Let me just share my screen. Desktop. Rodrigo, I would need to leave and enter again on the meeting because
yes. So perhaps, Bruno, if you don't mind, we should invite Jerry to present first, and then we go back to you. And is that okay?
You
want to try? Go ahead. Bear with us, dear audience, while Bruno logs out and back on. Thank you.
Possible. Okay.
Hey everyone, I see Bruno frozen here. I don't know, unless, let me give this another minute here. As I say, bear with us, and he should be right back on. Yeah, now I think he managed to log out, and I see him again. So
Thank
you, Bruno. Yeah. Welcome back.
Oh, great. Let's see if it works now. Can you guys see my presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I'd like first to thank Rodrigo and Susanna for the kind invitation. I'd like also to thank the interpreters and the museum staff to do this work today. Well, I'm especially happy to be in El Museo today to talk about Heitor's work, taking that today is Carnival's Eve, and considering that Heitor dos Prazeres were one of the most successful composers in the early 30s Carnival in Rio. For me, it's especially interesting information. But now I will move forward directly for my presentation. Well, I'll take as my starting point a 1946 report from the Illustrated News magazine Revista da Semana. This report presents to the Brazilian audience the exhibition The Negro Artist Comes of Age. That was at the time on a tour throughout the United States. Among long descriptions of the trajectories of artists such as Jacob Lawrence, Charles White, and Horace Pippin, the journalist makes a curious comparison. Pippin's work would be in the way between the painters Cardoso Jr. and Heitor dos Prazeres. Even though nowadays this comparison with Prazeres could sound awkward, taking the different contexts of both painters, it is helpful to understand the exchange of artistic knowledge within the African diaspora, which will be the main subject of my talk here. I will remind you a bit of Prazeres' artistic career. As I said before, Prazeres had a great visibility at the establishment of the modern samba in the Rio in the late 20s and early 30s. He personally negotiated among musicians, radio stations, journalists, and politicians the professionalization of his category. At the time, he already had contact with a cosmopolitan modernist culture, not only from the modernist painters that used to visit the sambas, but also from a large network of mostly Black musicians and dancers with a wide international transit, mostly in Paris and Latin America. After 1937's coup that led Brazil to a dictatorship, Prazeres saw his work as a musician decrease. In that year, he started to work in a low-income job at the new Ministry of Education and Health. At the time, he started also to paint. He made his pictorial work public in a newspaper report at the 50th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in Brazil, May 13, 1938. The 4 paintings he presented at that moment show a production that was already diverse, from a scene from slavery times to a self-portrait, as this one that was made 2 decades later. We today do not have access to any of those 4 first paintings. To the journalist, the originality of Prazeres' work was his interest in depict the Black Brazilian life in its complexity. In an interview with the same journalist made in 1943, Prazeres made a rare statement about one of his works. At the time, this painting was at his easel. Here I quote the journalist's comment. "Now you are working on a new cycle, the Runaway Psycho, or in Portuguese, o ciclo dos fugitivos." And then the journalist describes this specific painting. Humble people, white and Black, running away in the midst of luxuriant forests, carrying junk and children. Flee, flee amidst nature, splendorly alive and wild. Few look back, running away, running away. Nobody stops them. But why now you have this habit of making people running away. And then the painter answers, I'm not sure. People from the hills. An idea that came to me. Aren't they tearing down the favelas? The hills, in this case, were the morros, geographic spaces where lived most of Rio's low-income population, mostly Black. The impact of Rio's urban reforms in those neighborhoods was a main issue for Heitor since his first paintings. In 1943, occurred the partial destruction of Praça 11 to the construction of the monumental Avenida Presidente Vargas. Praça 11 was where the painter was born and raised. There, he lived till the end of his life, despite the city's changes. He used it to call the region Pequena África. This term is used until today, when it became an important site of memory to Black people in Rio. The initial comparison with Pippin's work from the 1946 journalist could make sense in they both effort to document and interpret Black life in their contexts. Although I would propose here a second possible pairing to this specific painting, thinking on the seriality of the Runaway Psycho. I wouldn't say that Prazeres knew Lawrence's work, which would be possible, but that both in different points of the Americas were using quite similar strategies to think about the political role of the artists at their time, strategies that were shared in cosmopolitan networks of the African diaspora. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruno. This was wonderful. Jerry, please join us. Jerry Philogene is an associate professor in the American Studies Department at Dickinson College and an independent curator. Her research and teaching focuses on the interdisciplinary American cultural history, art history, and visual arts of the Caribbean and the African diaspora, with an emphasis on the Francophone Caribbean, Black cultural politics, and theories of the African diaspora. She is currently co-curating, along with Catherine Smith, an exhibition on contemporary drapeau, flag textile, Haiti-based artist, Mirlan Constant, to open at the Fowler Museum at the University of California in spring 2023. And also completing a book manuscript entitled The Socially Dead and Improbable Citizen, Visualizing Haitian Humanity and Visual Aesthetics. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jerry, and I'd like you to have the word now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my slides. Perfect. Okay, wonderful. So it's really nice to be here. So nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our minds. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Susanna Temkin and Rodrigo Mora for inviting me to be a panelist on this symposium that is part of this important and timely exhibition, Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. It is very good to be with so many wonderful panelists. I've enjoyed listening to the presentations, and I look forward to the Q&A after our presentations. I'd like to also thank Christian Martyr and Helena Vidal, for their logistical organization and technical advice. In the 10 minutes or so that I have today, I'd like to share with you very, very briefly some of the ways in which I've been thinking about Black modernism and Haitian modernist aesthetics, focusing on 3 artists of Haitian descent who are in this exhibition: Préfet Bouffo, Antoine Olian, and Louisanne Saint-Florent. I look forward to our discussion during the Q&A. So I began with a quote from Gloria Enzeldua, the Chicana poet, activist, and scholar, taking from her essay, La Conciencia de la Mestiza, Towards a New Consciousness, which I taught yesterday in my Disorderly Women class. When one of my students read that passage to the class, because she found it to to have such a stark connection to some of the things that she's been working on. When I heard her pull this quote from Enzeldua, I thought to myself, how perfect it was for me to use to express what I see in the works in this exhibition, and specifically in the works of Dufaux, Olian, and Saint-Flour. Black modernity, how I've come to understand it, is a modernism that factors Blackness as a necessary condition of being, belonging, and as a condition of selfhood and life. Black modern aesthetics are central to what it means to live a human life. In their bold color palette, their compositions and visual formulations, Dufaux, Olian, and Saint-Flour works are saturated with a non-Western spiritual world which challenge Western artistries and harness postmodernist Black aesthetics, with Haiti at the center of Black Atlantic visual culture. In their works, these artists illustrate their intrinsic relationship among the human, the environment, and nature, one that is cognizant of the effects of the human on nature and on the environment, but also of nature and the environment on human, evoking a new form of life and a new way of living and understanding themselves as part of the modern world. Looking at these works, I'm struck by how these artists have engaged in creating cultural aesthetics that lead them to understand their own sense of self and their own sense of humanity, creating their own sense of what it means to be human and what it does mean to be free and to be liberated. So if for an artist such as Olian, the tradition of Vodou and its iconography have played a pivotal role in animating the images that are a foundational part of his oeuvre, then it is that engagement in Black modernism. That is the engagement that we are talking about. It brings us to the understanding of a symbiotic link of Black people to modernism and for the spiritual life fundamental to that Black modernity. His works allow for visual epistemology that imagines and knows the world differently. In knowing that world differently, then it asks you to position yourself in that world in a different way. First displayed in Vodou temples and incorporating the colors and veve specific to Loire, drapeaux have been part of traditional religious and aesthetic elements and practices in Haiti for decades. Artists ranging from the drapeau maker Mireille Delis, Rudy Azor, Yves Telemaque, and Mylène Constant. In this image on the screen, Guédé, various veve and snake-like figures representing Dambala, the dynamic life force in the universe, frame the Black and red cross held by a skeletal face, suggesting complex interactional processes between the living and the dead, blurring the life-death divide, and offering a visual discourse that articulates a central ethos by which Haitians on the island and in the diaspora survive and experience their humanity. I like the term alternate, I'm going to mess up this word, but there's a term that Rodrigo and Susanna use, alternate opicticality. That's it, opicticality, alternate opicticality, that Rodrigo and Susanna use in the exhibition materials that they shared with us. And I love that word because it so speaks, I think, to Olian's work. Alternate opicticality for me suggests not only another way of seeing, but another way of looking and being in the world. Radiant colors sparkle from the embellished surfaces as beads and sequins capture and reflect light in Olian's drapeau, calling forth and celebrating the Loire. As we see in Bosso, the bullhead figure whose body is complete with legs and arms in the shape of snakes. Olian's works are filled with light and tactile presence, evoke the spirits that they are meant to attract and to represent. His beaded and sequenced drapeaux resonate on multiple levels, presenting a vision of a Black modern world that defies Western conventions and representations that associate Vodou, Haiti, and Blackness with abjection and humanity and inhumanity. This is another piece by Olian. I believe the title of this piece is Saint James, but at the top part of the drapeau by the flag, Jacques is spelled there. So I'm wondering if this is actually a Saint Jacques, because it definitely takes on that, that image of Saint Jacques. This is an installation shot, a beautiful installation shot, I must say, for works of art that are so amazingly put up together. So thank you, Susanna and Rodrigo, for that. In Dufault's work, we are captivated by his perceptive and aesthetically inventiveness that suggests a symbiotic relationship with the sea, mountain, and land, and the people that occupy these otherworldly spaces. The imaginary world presented in Harbor View de Jacmel, Vue de Jacmel avec le pont de Noël, Harbor View of Jacmel with the Noël Bridge, we see Dufault's brilliant command of scale and composition. Oops, sorry. We see Dufault's brilliant command of scale and composition, color and perspective, inhabiting a world, a sense of being in the world that brings together landscape, architecture, nature, history, fantasy, and human presence. Upon looking at his well-known style, the viewer is mesmerized by the placement of the objects, the vibrant colors, the reds, the yellows, the blues, the greens that mark this futuristic dwelling. Our eyes take in every minute detail, from the tiny figures in boats to the loosely painted leaves on the trees, to the block-style windows on the houses, to the winding roads leading to the top of the mountains and bridges. Dufault's coastal landscapes and architectural wonder invite the viewer into a world filled with futurity, filled with possibilities that do not yet reside in Haiti. As the art historian Gérald Alex writes of Dufault's painting in Peintres Haïtiens, Dufault was part of a group of artists, and I quote, who chose to invest the landscape with their dreams of an infinite space contrasting with an increasingly oppressive reality, end quote. I suggest viewing these artists as interpreters and mediators of an aesthetic tradition and culture of the Black diaspora as we continue to explore the work of modern and contemporary artists of Haitian descent wherever they reside. In these deep, rich, and vibrant colors with paint possibly taken directly from the tube in a single application, considering form and color, Louisa Saint-Florent's bold visual assertion, for me, evoke a specific feminist perspective. While she's never called her work feminist or a woman or female-centered, and I might get some pushback for even thinking about this very, very loaded term to describe her work, but I imagine in her desire to place at the center of the canvas, at the center of the visual narrative, female subjects, be they young girls, older women, angels, or female lois as main figures, for me suggests a female-centered sensibility. That sort of bold and beautiful, yet unassuming sensibility that resonates from her work is yet another hallmark of Black modernism, one that is guided by a rich pictorial language to articulate a sense of self. Upon looking at her work, we find a painter working in the materiality of consciousness, aware of her position in the world, but also connecting with other worlds. Her paintings, particularly the ones included in this exhibition, are colorful, vibrant expressions that are often female-centered spaces, filled with care and honoring motherhood, a care that is as much about the careful treatment of paint as it is about the figures she depicts. That is what I see in the previous slide. I'm gonna go back. That is what I see in this slide, portrait of, it's without a title, portrait of mother with girls. Such beautiful details in the work provide a kind of energy that gathers at the compositional center, where we see female figures surrounded by birds and flowers, gathered in what might be a joyous occasion, and in another, perhaps a sadder occasion, if those are in fact tears coming from the eyes of the three female figures in portraits of women with two girls. Even in sadness, there is joy. While we do not know the names of the individuals whose image influenced these paintings, we can imagine that they gesture to a shared and collective female identity. We can then truly appreciate the bold colors, strong, firm lines and marks and textures of Saint-Fleurin's paintings, if we believe that her works participate in a fuller and holistic understanding of Black people's creativity and Black modernism. These three artists were operating at different times and in conversation with other artists. Dufault was considered part of the establishment of a vibrant art community in the 1940s in Haiti. Saint-Fleurin was part of the collective Mouvement Saint-Soleil in the 1970s, and later she went on to find the collective Cinq Soleil in the late 1980s. And Orléans working in the 1980s with other Haiti-based artists perfecting their craft. They were also working with a variety of artists in Haiti and those who traveled to Haiti from the United States, Europe, and Latin America, especially in the mid part of the 20th century. Similarly to the exhibition itself, these works and artists illustrate the use of traditional Haitian cultural motifs and creative styles, while reflecting a complex interplay among material, formal structure, and stylistic characters of Black modernism. The range of artistic perspectives in this exhibition attempts to map out the critical and artistic pathways occurring in, as the curators write, and I quote, different parts of the Americas and the Caribbean between the 1930s and the 1970s, end quote. They bring together artists who engage, challenge, and contribute to local and global art discourses, using traditional and formal, as well as non-traditional and non-formal art practices. Paintings, drawings, and sculptures made from conventional and non-conventional materials present an evocative balance of, on the one hand, works inspired by the religiosity that has been a central bedrock for modern art and culture, and on the other hand, contemporary pieces that are invested in transgressive postmodern art approaches to media and practices, and aesthetic practices. As such, Popular Painters and Other Visionaries allows for the possibility of generative conversations that encompass artistic traditions and global art histories to define art produced by self-taught and academically trained artists in ways not limited by the taxing and over-generalized descriptors. The artworks require us to rethink what we may have understood as self-taught, or even popular art for that matter. It is precisely in the creative spaces of the gallery that we can view the range of cross-cultural influences fashioned within transnational contexts, deeply rooted in deeply rooted in Black modernism. And it is in the creative imagination of these artists that we can see what a Black modernist aesthetics might look like. For those engaged in transgressive acts of liberation, freedom is often taken, sometimes in fierce ways, and other times quietly and creatively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I would like to applaud. That's the reality. And it's weird because we don't have the auditorium.
I know, right?
Ambiance, no, for Zoom, but I'm sure everybody's applauding yours and our other panelists' presentations for today's panel. Bruno and Anne, can you please turn your cameras on? And I would like to invite you, Susanna, as well, if you are in front of the computer. If not, no worries. To join me just as we try to, there's so many paths open by each of your presentations for our panel. But I would like perhaps in a little kamikaze way, I don't know, to touch on something that was also, somehow part of a question from our audience. I'm going to read the question, and I'm going to bring an indagation or a question of my own. So could we see the work of the Black modernists in this panel as contributing and expanding our understanding of Afrofuturism today? Could the wrongly perceived artistic backwardness function as a gateway for futuristic liberatory imaginations? I really love this question. I would like to add that one of the things that there was a question also about outliers in American vanguard art, the National Gallery of Art exhibition curated by Lynn Cook, and how does this show relate to that show? But one thing that I would just like to mention, and perhaps you can go back to that later, is the chronology of the exhibition preceding the chronology of the museum foundation, right? So this is in a way an exhibition that tries to look to a prehistory of the museum, no? And really try to open up the field a little bit more within its limits, obviously, but to open up the field by indicating in a Pan-American way afterwards possible historical ground and reference for artists practicing today, or so just to echo this question. And I would like to have you, perhaps, Jerry, because I think you touched on some of this subjects, just wrapping up your presentation, to take on this question. Thank you. If you want me to repeat
yes,
it.
if you wouldn't mind repeating it. I was
Could we see the
listening,
work?
but not really.
I'm sorry, I over-elaborated on it. But we see the work of the Black modernists in this panel as contributing and expanding our understanding of Afrofuturism today. Could a wrongly perceived artistic backwardness function as a gateway for futuristic, liberatory imaginations? Question mark.
Oh, I see. Okay. I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that if we imagine the idea of modernism, or in particular in the cases of these artists who are, as you and I think and Susanna think about the ideas of these artists have being outside of the kind of mainstream art world. And I actually would like to suggest that perhaps they are actually at the center, a part of this conversation of modernism, because of the possibilities that they bring in their work. Not only the possibilities of the types of images that they are imagining on the and then placing on the canvas, but the ways in which they go about doing the works and the materials that they're doing. So I think, in a way, my answer would be yes. They imagine and allow us the space to actually think of what something might look like differently. And if we think of Afrofuturism, providing the opportunity to think about a different way of living and a different way of even understanding the idea of center and margin, and really pushing at those limited conversations. So my answer would be yes, they actually give us the opportunity to participate in thinking about Afrofuturism. And even the second part of the question, which I think was about could their wrongly perceived artistic backwardness function as a gateway? Again, the answer would be yes, because I think that that idea of their backwardness is because of the different types of images that they're evoking, the different types of materials that they're using, and the different places in which they're producing the work. So all of that, because it moves us away from a Western definition of modernism to really imagine and think about brown and Black people as part of that definition. I hope I wasn't too long in my answer.
That was terrific. Anne, would you like to take on the same question? I'd be curious, how would you place Pippin in this conversation? And yeah. You muted, Anne. Please unmute yourself so we can hear you.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's and I think it encodes a lot of problems with the field in general, because Pippin, first of all, was not perceived as backward, and he was entirely in the very center of the mainstream of contemporary art of his day. That's why I showed that Ad Reinhardt cartoon. So, you know, what I think...
Although he's flying above a little separate, no, in the diagram.
Well, when you read the when you read the caption that Reinhardt offered for his cartoon, he said that the art is evolving from the ground to the sky. So the fact that Pippin is actually off the tree and flying is, I think, evidence of Reinhardt's appreciation of his sophistication, actually. So yeah, I think the artists perched on the branches are less evolved in Reinhardt's argument. So obviously everybody in the 1940s didn't feel the way that Reinhardt did, but Reinhardt is no slouch when it comes to modernism. So I'm going to defer to him. And also it got published, right? So so I think that what I think Pippin actually does is show us that our projections about artists' reputations and artists' relationships are far more restrictive than maybe the reality actually was. And that that's been something that I've found for, in working with Pippin and on Pippin for years, is that, the other thing that I found is that people tend to want to group self-taught artists as if they had things in common. And in my experience, practically none of them has anything to do with any other one of them, except the fact that at one point somebody threw them all in a bin together. And so Pippin has, often discussed in company with Lawrence or discussed in company with William Edmondson, who are equally fascinating artists and who have nothing whatsoever except the fact that they were working at the same time, and they're artists of color who have since been championed as Black modernists, although in some cases they were self-consciously so, and in some cases they were just de facto moderns by virtue of the style that they brought to a body of work that really was not intended necessarily to correlate with the latest in contemporary art, even as it was being advanced as the latest in contemporary art by, say, the Museum of Modern Art. I know this is a long-winded answer, and I apologize because it really sidesteps the question. But I think in Pippin's case, the question isn't a particularly, is more illuminating for the way it shows our perceptions of him now than it is illuminating about who he actually was.
No, this is great, and I think it makes perfect sense how you makes a case for like the centrality of Pippin in the the art historical narrative of his own time, and this is really, I think it's a great point. But Bruno, we share the Brazilian art background. I'd be curious with your answer in the case of Heitor.
Yeah. Do you want to write something? I don't know.
Excuse me?
Do you want to write something you were saying?
No. I was just curious about your perception on Heitor in this in the context of the question by our audience member, Julian Gonzalez.
Thanks. Well, taking the idea of Afrofuturism as a possibility to create projects of future centered on Blackness, I do believe at first that Heitor dos Prazeres were at his time producing, especially during the 20s and 30s, projects of future, taking his role negotiating the rights for Black people or community people from his time, and also that he was recognized this way, especially from the artists, the Black artists from the democratization after the 40s. If we take, for example, how the Teatro Experimental do Negro, Black experimental theater artists were found about his presence and the events. So it was quite common that Heitor dos Prazeres were invited to play at the events, at the public events from the Teatro Experimental do Negro. And also when we see how through a network of Black artists that was composed, for example, for Abdias do Nascimento, but not only by Tomás Santa Rosa that were at the jury of the first biennial. He was awarded at the first biennial. So this award for me tells us a lot about how he had a recognition, especially within this Black artist community. And I feel that.
What about what's your perception of in terms of like younger people now?
I feel that this recognition within the biennial is a recognition also that his experience it was an important experience to them to rethink in this moment of redemocratization that people were writing a new Bill of Rights in Brazil, to think the rights of Black people. It was a central moment for the right people, or Black people's right in Brazil. If we think, for example, that was the same year that racism became a crime in Brazil, and it happened through the hands of this same Black movement that the Teatro Experimental do Negro was central to.
Thank you, Bruno. I will have a question from Abigail Lapan Dardashti to Jerry. This is a question for you, Jerry. I really appreciate your discussion of Black modernity and Black modernism, in particular because it unsettles the persistent and inaccurate narrative that centralizes Peters, Breton, and even MoMA at the center of Haitian artistic production in the 1930s and 40s. Mm-hmm. How do you see your definition of Black modernism expanded to artists in other regions of the Americas?
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Abigail. I'm so glad you were able to join us. That's a very good question. And I'm glad that you saw the kind of gesturing that I was trying to make with really trying to unsettle the narrative of Peters and Breton and all the other individuals who kind of have been articulated as kind of creating, Haitian art. And of course, we know the problematics with that. And many scholars are, and you're one of them, but who've been also working on dismantling that. And I think that thinking about a Black modernism, and I started off by saying that I see that Blackness is at the center of the conversation to kind of think about this modernism and modernity. But we can also extend that if we were to think about indigenous people, indigenous individuals in certain parts in the Americas. And so Blackness can be read, of course, as phenotypically or as a racial kind of category, but I'm also thinking of individuals who kind of see themselves and have a kind of acknowledgement of the presence of Africa in the spaces in which they currently reside. And it doesn't have to be a contemporary presence, as if a contemporary, but there is a kind of cultural heritage that is in part African, but also indigenous. And if those kinds of acknowledgements are made, and then that kind of, those artistic conversations are part of that, how we understand modernity. I mean, that's how I would explain it reaching and crossing into or becoming part of other parts of the Americas, and not simply, let's say, in Haiti or in Guadeloupe or Martinique or other parts where there is a clear African presence.
Thank you. Let me see if we have other questions in the Q&A. Thank you, Bruno. There's a question for you, Bruno. I really enjoyed, from Adele, from the previous panel. Thank you all for your excellent papers. Bruno, I really enjoyed your talk. Would you like to expand on the seriality you were noting in Prazeres paintings? Do you see as a strategy across his practice or just that serious?
Thank you, Adele, for the question. It's a very interesting question because even though they say about they talk about the series and they describe it very clearly that he's doing a series and there were other works. Our research about Heitor dos Prazeres in Brazil need to expand much more to that we can, for example, find the other artworks that were from this series. So that's the only work that is known that was part of this series. I feel that in his work, the shape of it changed a lot in terms of he was always answering to market interests. So at this beginning, he was working much more freely until the mid-40s. And then he started to sell much more as a popular painter. So he started to reproduce himself a lot, which happened throughout his whole career. And it's something that he, in an interview, said that he didn't like that exactly, but it was the only way that he could pay his bills because that was what most of the public wanted him to do, to reproduce the same paintings over and over, or at least the same patterns. But yeah, we have like this very different moments of his career that I believe that we need to study much more to understand, because, for example, after the award at the biennial after 51, he had this moment that he started to work with numerous projects related with other media. For example, doing dresses to theaters, like doing clothes for theater, etc. So, or working more with the musical industry. So I feel that we need to trace more to understand all those changes within his career that's extremely vast.
Yeah, I understand there's also like this tensions with the market. In the case of Heitor, there's a huge abundance of paintings from a certain period that I know everybody's very nervous about. And I also see like these structures, that you call like patterns that got a lot of repetition. But it's an interesting aspect, the seriality. Even in the show, we have the two paintings we have hanging. The show you focused your presentation on is not physically here. It's another painting from the Museo de Arte de São Paulo, from Mask. I believe it's currently hanging in Histórias Afro-Atlânticas, Afro-Atlantic Histories, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. The Fugitivo series, the Runaway series, as you translated. But the two paintings we have here is one from the 60s and one from the 40s, and they're very extremely different, in terms of color. And this is, I think this is an interesting aspect of his production. And I really think it's wonderful we're talking about him on a Carnival Friday, Sexta-feira de Carnaval. But we have another question for you, Bruno. If we can just like maybe stay on for another 5 minutes. Really like Rodrigo's and Susie's use of the term. I think it was alternate opticality. Was it alternative maybe? Bruno, can you say something about this in relation to Heitor dos Prazeres? Does that resonate with you at all, Bruno? Alternate opticality? It's all good if it doesn't.
Really, I don't think that I understood completely the concept that answer this question, but yeah, thank you for this question.
No, it's fine. I think it's a term we used in terms of just like the otherworldliness, and that's to quote you, Jerry, on our preparation meeting, in terms of materials, like the sequin and the beads, and I think that's also Susanna's coined that in one of our wall labels, and that made the way into your talk. But I think this was really a wonderful conversation. I thank you so much, Anne. I think we're coming to the end of our virtual symposium today. So I thank you so much, Anne Monahan, for your presentation, Jerry Filogen and Bruno Pinero. I hope to see you at El Museo soon, as well as Victor Manuel Espinosa, Adele Nelson, and Susanna Temkin. And am I forgetting someone? Maybe I am, but I won't. Can someone there come in my rescue, perhaps? Who was the third speaker at the first, and Raphael Konig, of course. Raphael Konig, thank you so much as well. And I hope to see you very soon, Popular Painters and Other Visionaries. It's tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow is the last day to see the exhibitions at Museo del Barrio on Fifth Avenue, just across from Central Park on 103rd Street. Thank you all, and
Thank you.
have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.